Hi students, for chapter 10 we'll be talking about emotional development. Now, the word emotion is something that you're probably very familiar with. We have names for different emotions like fear and surprise and happiness and sadness. And of course, we'll be talking about some of the emergence of those emotions. But emotional development involves more than just acquiring new emotions. It also involves developing emotional competence. We become capable of new and also more complex emotions, but then also our relationships with others change. We understand others more. We understand what emotions they may be experiencing, what their displays of emotion mean. We also learn to recognize our own emotions, to regulate our emotions, and manage our emotions over time. So much of this developmental change happens in infancy and childhood, but we do see some emotional development changes across the lifespan. So beginning with infants' emotional experience. When infants are born at birth, they are able to show some very basic emotions. They can show interest in something, like interest in a toy or in a picture that goes across their field of vision. They may experience distress, especially if they are uncomfortable. They may show disgust. So if you put a particular flavor in a baby's mouth, especially one that is very bitter, they will scrunch up their nose and show that very particular disgust face in response to a flavor that they don't like. Interestingly, about disgust, it really does begin as this response to something that doesn't taste good, but with age, our disgust can transform. We still get disgusted by certain flavors, but there's also this level of psychological disgust, like when someone does something that kind of disturbs you in a way that you're really uncomfortable with, and you can also use that same face to express and disgust in their actions. Uh, think about not just disturbing behavior, but kind of gross behavior. Like if you see someone use the restroom and then walk out the door without washing their hands, and you can kind of go, ew, and scrunch up your nose, much in the same way that a baby scrunches up his nose when he tastes a flavor that he doesn't like. Now, between 2 and 7 months, infants begin to show some additional expressions of emotions. They begin to show anger, and anger is a response that we have when our path is blocked. So frustration and anger are very close, and we can have anger with the source of our frustration. Sadness, joy, surprise, and also fear. And these emotions, they appear so early in life, and they're so consistent across cultures, the expressions that each emotion represents, uh, that they must be biologically determined. Now, again, these tend to emerge in all infants at about the same age. They're seen and interpreted similarly across all cultures. So when you see a look of disgust or a look of surprise, it's generally the same across the world, no matter what culture it is. Even infants who are born blind and have never seen facial expressions before, they will display some of the same facial expressions. So we know it's not just modeling, we know that this is biologically pre-programmed. Now, infants originally or first start smiling as a reflexive response to a change in their arousal state. So something changes and they kind of reflexively smile because of that change. And between 6 and 10 weeks of age, they start to show a social smile. And this is a smile that's in response to familiar people. So younger than that, you'll smile at a baby and they won't necessarily smile back. And then there's this big change that parents and family notice at that age, where if you look down and smile at a baby, they smile back, and then you start to see even more enriching and emotional interactions amongst family members with their babies. So those were the basic, and they're also called primary emotions. The next level of emotions that children develop are what's called self-conscious emotions. These emotions don't develop until a child develops self-consciousness, self-awareness, the awareness that they are separate from other people, that they observe themselves and their own behavior and then judge them by what they think is appropriate rules and standards that they've learned from their outside environment. They compare their behavior with those standards. And if they match or don't match their behavior with those standards, then it can affect the way that they feel. So, for example, if you're not supposed to, steal a cookie, and you know that that's bad, and then you learn that your mom is angry with you because you stole a cookie, then may experience shame or guilt for doing something bad. So what this takes is for you to understand that you are separate from other people, that there are rules and standards, like you're not supposed to steal, that you are supposed to live by, and that you've broken that standard, and then it can lead to a negative feeling. Also, embarrassment is a slightly different one, but kind of along the same lines. There are standards for your behavior. For example, you should not be walking around with toilet paper on your shoe. And if you happen to step out of the bathroom, have toilet paper on your shoe, and notice it, you'll end up with this mild embarrassment that you have done something that isn't up to a standard of behavior. Pride is a positive emotion that children feel when they've actually met some type of standard, and so they feel good about themselves. And then empathy requires you identifying or feeling what someone else is feeling. And of course, this requires you to understand that you are separate from other people. So again, this self-consciousness, being aware of oneself, emerges around 15 to 18 months of age. And we'll actually come back to this and talk about it in the next chapter, because there are ways that we can test to see if children understand that the person in the mirror is themselves, and that they start to develop this own story about their lives and about what they're experiencing. This is when we see the further development of emotions. And then also the very earliest memories start to form a little bit after this, when we have not just the development of self-conscious emotions, but also the development of language, which facilitates the creation of those new memories. Emotion regulation also emerges with age, and this is one's ability to control their own emotions. And infants have some very basic methods or strategies that are used to try to control one's emotions and not to display all of the sadness or frustration that they're actually feeling. So when infants get kind of overwhelmed and have some strong emotions, they may suck vigorously on objects like thumb sucking. They may turn their bodies away from any distressing stimuli. They'll smile, they'll avert their gaze, and then they'll show fussiness to try to get out of whatever situation is making them feel uncomfortable. So, with this very early emotion regulation, parents are often the ones who are first facilitating this and helping to control babies' emotions. Parents will do things like, hold the baby and, bounce them on their knee or pat their back. And then infants eventually start to regulate it on their own, like sucking their thumb and turning away from something that is uncomfortable. And then in toddlerhood, you see even greater or more complex attempts to regulate one's own emotions, engaging in self-soothing behaviors, distracting, like instead of looking at one thing, look at something else and entertain and fill your mind with something else other than that which is distracting, and more active attempts to change the situation. Now, emotion regulation develops in relation to an increasing ability to use language. And in childhood, we see that kids will start to talk to themselves, to calm themselves down, and eventually that talking to themselves becomes an internal monologue that we do, even still in adulthood, when you're telling yourself in your mind, calm down, it's going to be okay, relax. This is also emotional regulation in adulthood. Parents use many techniques to help their infants learn to manage their emotions. So whether it be direct intervention in changing the situation or trying to change their behaviors, modeling for how to calm themselves down or how to express their emotions appropriately, selective reinforcement. This could be responding positively when they are calming themselves down, or then when they respond calmly to a difficult situation. and then not reinforcing that behavior if they have a tantrum. So we ignore tantrums when their emotions are out of control. Verbal instruction, like, okay, breathe, calm down, right? And also touch, giving hugs, giving that comfort. Uh, uh, Parents will respond to infants and children's emotions, with that comfort. But eventually, what we want to see is that infants and toddlers are able to control their emotions on their own. Now, unfortunately, some caregivers may interpret emotional displays as attempts at manipulation of the parent, of trying to get something. So they're crying in order to manipulate the parent, and they're not actually crying because they're upset. It's not a valid expression of their feeling. And this is unfortunate because babies aren't necessarily faking it. And so they really, truly are upset, and so this may result in insensitive responses to children's emotional displays and can even interfere with emotional development. And this can become, a more serious problem if it continues, where parents disregard a child's emotions and don't offer them kind of descriptions of their emotions, or help them through soothing emotions during difficult times. And these children have a more difficult time emoting their emotions, sometimes even into adulthood. Parental stress, depression, and conflict can be some maladaptive social contexts that will influence emotional development in infancy. So, for example, mothers who are depressed tend to be less responsive to babies, and they show less affection. They use more negative forms of touch, and they show more negative emotions and behaviors. And perhaps because of this, infants of depressed mothers show a variety of negative outcomes and slightly more inhibited emotional development. Face-to-face play, so smiling, vocalizing, and animated facial expressions, is a really important way that infants learn how to manage their emotions. So as mothers are smiling and vocalizing and showing surprise and whatnot, this is also what infants learn to show. Because mothers are not showing negative emotions as much, then infants who are not exposed to negative emotions will be more likely to hide and inhibit those emotions. And then they feel more comfortable with displaying those more animated, positive emotions. Interactive play turns into more active play that corresponds with developing motor skills. So infants' ability to get around, to crawl, and to eventually pull themselves up, and to sometimes get in a lot of trouble because of their now ability to move around. Crawling and walking makes parents respond with more happiness and more pride. Think about the first time that babies get around and are able to move on their own. But this also introduces new challenges to parent-infant interactions, because kids are now on the go, focused on other things in their environment. And also they become more vulnerable to hazards and walking away. So kids are able to get into cupboards that they couldn't reach before, and pull things down upon themselves. So it can be quite challenging to parents and can bring more negative interactions, because they're more likely to say no to their children as they are reaching toward that light socket. Now, as infants become more mobile, emotional outbursts become more common, and this is a reflection of their increases in frustration. I mean, think about the child who wants to press all the buttons on the TV or the PlayStation or the stove. They get frustrated when they're told no and have to move away. So this leads to some more, that test of wills leads to emotional development, in that it can be more frustration and anger and more rich view of emotions, as opposed to just the positive emotions and a plain distress that younger infants show. Now, infants are innately prepared to attend to facial displays of emotion. So they have this natural tendency to look at the face of other people and try to see what emotions they're displaying and feeling, especially their caregivers. The displays are biologically significant, and infants' ability to recognize these facial expressions is really important for human survival. So when an infant is put in a dangerous or unfamiliar situation, they will look toward an adult to interpret their facial expression in order to find clues about how to respond to this situation. So in the picture that I have put in here on the left-hand side, this young baby is on what's called the visual cliff. So this is a patterned table. It kind of looks like a white and red checkerboard, like a picnic cloth. And then it appears to have a cliff and then drop off to the floor where you see the bottom that also has the same checkerboard print. Now, it has the appearance of a cliff, but it isn't actually a cliff. There is plexiglass, so the child won't actually fall, but they have the appearance of being on a cliff. So when they're unsure about how to react, should I step onto the other side of this? Is it safe? Mothers can actually coax and convince their infants to come over across the visual cliff, even though it appears to be dangerous. So when there's an unfamiliar or unsure situation, children will look at adults in order to interpret that situation. And a familiar example of this might be a child who falls down and hurts himself, and he has that moment of, oh no, how do I respond to this? And you can look back at mom, right? Social referencing, look back at mom and try to figure out, is this something that I should be upset about? And depending on how mothers respond, infants and children can respond with fear, with panic. If mothers say, oh my goodness, are you bleeding? Then that can really terrify a child. But if a parent responds with calm and with comfort and says, it's all right, just brush it off, then the child learns to interpret that situation as being safe and that they'll be okay. Now, this social referencing is particularly challenging for infants where the mother has postpartum depression. So this is clinical depression after giving birth to children, because those mothers are not as likely to display clear emotions, because these emotional displays are inhibited by the depression that they're experiencing. Emotional display rules specify the circumstances under which emotions should or shouldn't be expressed. So let's just jump forward a bit and talk about us as adults. So as adults, we know that it's usually inappropriate to laugh during a funeral or express intense anger towards your boss or professor. We learn these rules over time, that there are certain emotions that should be showed at some times and other emotions that should be kind of hidden or suppressed. Young children begin picking up on these rules fairly early in life through their interactions with others. Emotions that are considered acceptable, as well as ways of expressing them, differ by culture and context. North American parents model positive emotions when interacting with their babies. They show mostly joy, surprise, and interest. They tickle, they make their babies laugh, and children just squeal with pleasure, and this is encouraging babies to be loud and expressive in a positive way. So they're making more expressive babies. The Gusi and Aka people of Central Africa actually prefer to keep their babies quiet and calm, and they don't engage in much face-to-face play. So infants learn to restrict these strong emotions and have differing emotional displays. Now, stranger wariness is what we call the fear of strangers, or fear of unfamiliar people. And this emerges at about 6 months of age and increases through the first year of life. It decreases again, or it then decreases starting at around 15 months of age. So there is a typical time period in which stranger wariness is a perfectly normal part of human development. And when infants show wariness, it depends on a few factors. So some infants will show stranger wariness earlier, some will show it later, some will have it a bit stronger, some a little bit less. Genetics affects how strongly and when a child will show stranger wariness, overall temperament, their past experience too. So whether they were passed around a lot as a babies or just raised by maybe just one person or two people. If they're not used to strangers, then they'll be uncomfortable with strangers. Also, the characteristics of the stranger can influence how they feel around these strangers. And it could be a few things. It could be something physical, like a beard often elicits some stranger wariness from children who are unfamiliar with the look of a beard on a man's face, or adults who are insensitive to the baby's emotions and maybe act intrusively and don't take a step back when infants actually show that they're uncomfortable with them. And also, the situation in which they meet a stranger can influence how comfortable they feel. If they're home in a familiar context, then they may be more receptive to seeing strangers as opposed to being a new environment, which can also bring some discomfort.
Now, stranger wariness is also influenced by culture and also the mother's level of anxiety. Mothers who are anxious themselves have babies who display more stranger anxiety. In childhood, we see some pretty dramatic changes in the understanding of emotions. Children begin to understand the factors that affect emotions. At first, they understand that external, so things outside of themselves affect emotion. Like they're able to give a reason of why they're upset. Like, my cookie broke, that's why I'm upset. And I kind of have to take a moment to laugh because there are always those funny stories of a child who, took a bite of their own chicken nugget, and then they're so upset that there's a bite out of their own chicken nugget, yet they did it themselves. So kind of a funny stage where they become upset at these external factors, but don't necessarily recognize that sometimes they are the cause of that problem or the limitations of what they're observing. Now, later in elementary school, children begin to understand that internal factors can also affect emotion. So thoughts, desires, motivations, and beliefs, all of those internal factors affect how a person feels about a situation. For example, theory of mind. Children's understanding that other people have their own perspectives, that they have their own emotions, that they see with the world from a different side, that they have their own thoughts and their own feelings. They're able to apply their understanding of emotions in order to understand others and to help others. So children who were given two scenarios of others who, saw a monster and believed it was real, or saw a monster and didn't think it was real, those children who knew that the child believed it was real would say that they thought the child would be scared. So they understand that other child's beliefs will influence their own emotions. Interactions with others also play an important role in advancing children's understanding of emotions. For example, parents talk about emotions, and this helps to give labels to emotions. What does it mean to be angry or disappointed or frustrated? Parents will label these emotions, help identify what caused these emotions, and then what solutions there are to reduce some of these negative emotions. Interactions with siblings will help in giving practice identifying emotions. They may anticipate the emotional responses of others and also use their emotional understanding to influence their relationships with others and affect the behavior of others as well. Children also become better able to manage their emotions and how they're displayed. So this just generally increases with age. To kids, being better able to hide their emotional reactions. And I actually encourage you to go onto YouTube and look up Jimmy Kimmel's Christmas presents to children. And he has people give really terrible Christmas gifts, like a black banana or a half-eaten sandwich or a girl's coloring book to a boy, right? So they'll give these terrible gifts to children and say, oh my goodness, I gave you a gift. And it's interesting to see children's responses because some children will act out in anger and frustration, like, you are the worst parent ever. This is a terrible, horrible present. And other kids have learned to regulate those emotions, and that they've learned that it's appropriate to always be happy with a gift and to say something positive about the gift, even if the gift is a terrible gift. So there are some kids who are like, oh, I love peanut butter sandwiches. Thank you so much. So anyways, it's hilarious, and you should absolutely go and view that. Now, these abilities to regulate emotions are influenced by several factors, like just simple cognitive development, theory of mind, the understanding of others' perspectives, and also language development, the ability to talk and discuss issues and emotions in one's life. Now, what I was just discussing is kind of this reflection in emotional regulation of children's learning of emotional display rules. So children continue to learn that emotions can be intentionally hidden through the use of display rules, but then also they start to learn that other people may have hidden emotions and thoughts and feelings that they weren't aware of themselves. And the awareness and application of these display rules emerge over childhood, and we continually get better a bit with age. So I would say that still some people, are not 100% knowing exactly what the rules are for different contexts and what is appropriate in displaying emotions, or perhaps some people just choose to not obey those social rules. Exposure to community violence presents a constant threat to children's and parents' safety. And this is a really important contextual risk to cognitive development that we need to consider. Children in these violent communities learn that the world is a dangerous and unpredictable place, and that parents are unable to protect them. So this may affect their natural curiosity and also their desire to learn by exploring the world. So this exposure to community violence is linked with anxiety, worry about themselves and the future and others, and also post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms because of some of the violence and trauma that they have experienced. Now, resilience in children is the ability to respond or perform positively, to have good outcomes, even in the face of adversity, to achieve and make excellent progress in their life and have these great accomplishments even when they have many disadvantages, or to significantly exceed expectations given that they came from a poor home, a disadvantaged school, a community with violence or otherwise other disadvantages. So this question comes up quite a bit. Why is it that some children or some people have such disadvantaged traumatic backgrounds and then they end up rising above it and accomplishing so much, whereas others live their lives really burdened by these past experiences? And that's what we're talking about here is resilience, is the ability to respond and perform positively even when you have these adverse experiences. So we've got some risk factors, but then also protective factors that will lead to more likelihood of resilience or less likelihood of resilience. So these risk factors are any individual or contextual challenges, and this really taxes one's coping capacities. So it leads to more psychological stress, and it means that whatever factors are going on in one's life, they have more difficulty with dealing with it and overcoming it and achieving more. For example, if they experience divorce, bullying, sexual abuse, if they came from a low socioeconomic status, so for example, low income family or neighborhood, exposure to poverty-stricken and dangerous neighborhoods. These are all risk factors. And the more risk factors that a child is exposed to, the more difficult it is for a child to adjust, and the more likely they are to have psychological and behavioral problems because of it. So it makes them difficult to be resilient. It's like it's all piling on top of one another. Now, protective factors are any influences that promote positive outcomes, and so therefore it's likely to reduce any of these negative outcomes or problems that arise from difficult circumstances. And one important protective factor is the presence of a very important person in one's life. And in the research literature, they're referred to as VIPs, very important person or people. And this means that just one person in someone's life, like a coach or a teacher or an aunt, just one person could offer some of this protection and enable them to overcome a lot of these challenges that they have because they've developed a good relationship with that person. It allows them to trust in others, to feel confident that the world does have nice people in it, that they're generally safe, and that they've made emotional connections with others. So I encourage you to reach out to young children who come from disadvantaged backgrounds and be that very important person to make a difference in their life. Now, moving on to adolescence and adulthood. Now, Stanley Hall, the kind of father of the time period of adolescence, so he really developed the study of the adolescent period. He theorized that adolescence is a period of what's called storm and stress. that there is this turmoil of lots of emotions and conflict that happen during adolescence. Now, while research shows that adolescence may be stormy and stressful for some, it's not typically a developmental problem. It's not inevitable, it's not universal. In fact, many individuals go through adolescence without fighting with their parents and having all of these tumultuous emotions that are overwhelming and up and down. And instead, many adolescents can actually become closer to their parents during this time, or experience kind of very even keel emotions. So storm and stress is definitely not a universal. Now, the way that they collected data on this study was by using the experience sampling method. So this involves paging participants. Now, some of you may not know that word, but it's kind of like an alarm going off on your cell phone. So it's an alarm going off throughout the day, and then asks a person to report what they were doing at that time and also the emotions that they felt. So this way, we are randomly sampling adolescents' emotions throughout the day, as opposed to just asking them to report when they're feeling something. So now we can really see, are they actually more emotional throughout the day? Or perhaps it's just an issue of them reporting more emotions in their memory, and our memories are not necessarily the greatest. So this is used to measure adolescents' experience in response to contextual influences. And again, we see that although some adolescents may have some tendency to react emotionally, again, that's not a universal experience. Now, unfortunately, the greatest period of unhappiness and anxiety occurs in early adulthood, when those individuals are faced with many choices and uncertainty. And I'm sure that many of you can relate to this. Who am I going to be? What am I going to do with my life? How am I going to pay rent? What job am I going to get? So early adulthood tends to be that period of time with feeling unsure and also not having great resources to really find the pleasures in life. Positive emotions tend to increase over adulthood until about age 70 to 80, and then they stabilize. So about 70 to 80, we see some stable positive emotions. Now, in some studies, you'll actually see a slight decrease at the later age range, but that might be because of the onset of some serious aging illnesses. And when a person becomes ill because of older age and the diseases of older age, then they lose their independence. They're no longer able to do what they want to do. And so that might be related to health. So if you just consider healthy older adults, typically healthy older adults are kind of along those stable lines of happiness. Now, adults experience emotions in more complex ways. So they have a more simultaneous experience of both positive and negative emotions. So those mixed emotions and complex emotions are more likely to be felt by adults. Now, adolescents and adults are going to encounter quite a bit of stress. They will have to deal with coping with these stressors and then developing hardiness to these stressors. Daily hassles are those small stressors that just quickly accumulate and influence your mood and your ability to cope. And I'm sure that many of you are thinking, oh my goodness, I completely relate to this. Whether it be the traffic in the morning, the long line at Starbucks that makes you a little bit late, the computer that won't print, right? All of these daily stressors really can influence your mood and your ability to cope with day-to-day life. Middle-aged adults experience more daily stressors than adults of any other age. They're pressed to meet multiple demands of career and family, but often the demands of caring for two generations, so their children and their elderly parents. So middle-aged adults are often referred to as the sandwich generation. They're caring for the generation younger than them and the generation older than them, which just adds to more of this stress and daily hassles, more to take care of. Now, some adults are better than others at adapting to these daily stressors, and we call that hardiness. Those who are more hardy have a greater ability to adapt, have a high sense of self-efficacy. They believe that they're effective in their life. They feel a sense of control over their lives and their experiences, and they view challenges as opportunities for personal growth, as instead of challenges as kind of failure and a sign that they're incompetent. And also, they feel a sense of commitment to their life choices. A significant area of research for those who study emotional and social development is the idea of attachment. Attachment is this lasting emotional bond between two people, and they want to maintain closeness to the other in order to ensure that the relationship continues. And I want you to think about emotional ties that you may have with people or even with animals in your own life, and the efforts that you go in order to maintain closeness because you care about this person and you want to be sure that this relationship continues. And sometimes it can make you do all sorts of things that you don't want to do. For example, your friend may ask you to help them move. I know I'm not a big fan of helping people move furniture, but I may do it because I care about that emotional and social bond continuing. So this is just one expression of an emotional attachment to a friend that makes you strive to maintain that closeness. So this is a strong emotional bond that endures over time, and John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth are the major theorists in this area of psychology. Now, Bowlby proposed an ethological perspective on attachment. He suggested that attachment is actually adaptive. It helps an infant become more likely to survive because it is attached to its mother. So it ensures the survival of the human species. This attachment bond between caregivers and infants ensures that the two will remain close in proximity, and thereby the mother will aid in the survival of the infant and ultimately of the species. So that's why it's an ethological, I think more biological approach, because it ensures the species. It's kind of like this inborn tendency to want to have this bond. Now, the infant has signaling behaviors, these behaviors that will help bring the caregiver to the baby, crying and smiling, cooing and clinging, but especially these behaviors of discomfort and looking like they're scared. A mother will run and make sure that the baby is okay and comforted. And then the baby will learn to trust its mother and that the world is safe and that everything is okay. Now, this emerges over time. Attachment of the baby to the mother progresses through several developmental phases. So the first one is birth to 2 months, and this is called indiscriminate social responsiveness. Babies learn to associate caregivers with the relief of distress, and will respond to any caregiver who reacts to their signals whatsoever. So indiscriminate, whoever comes to comfort them, they will feel comforted. Think newborn babies in a nursery, anyone holding them, they will feel comforted. And 2 months through 6 to 7 months, babies will show discriminating sociability. So they begin to discriminate among adults and prefer familiar people and want to be around their mothers and be more comforted by their mothers and fathers. And I say mothers and fathers, but let's be honest, there are many families that are not the traditional mother and father with an infant. And there are many children who are being raised by grandparents, by foster parents, by siblings. And so really when I say mothers and fathers in kind of the story of attachment, just know that instead it's more primary caregivers. Most of the research is done with mothers and fathers because of course that's more common, but these ideas will translate to any primary caregiver. So stage 3 is 7 to 24 months. Children will develop attachments to specific caregivers. So not just discriminate familiar people, this group of people that I'm comfortable with, but very specific, this is mama. And then reciprocal relationships, 24 to 30 months, they engage in interactions with primary caregivers as partners. They take turns in initiating interactions within the attachment relationship and really show this bond with their parent. Now, Bowlby suggested that the primary caregiver serves as a secure base. So this is wherever the child may go, whenever it becomes frightened. This is like running home to whoever will, make me comfortable, but instead mom could just be a few feet away. When something is unfamiliar and scary, I may go and run to mom and, well, crawl to mom and feel comforted and feel okay. So infants use their attachment figure as a secure base. And think about a base is one where you can go to if you need it, but you also feel comforted to leave the base so you can explore the world. When you feel secure, you also feel okay leaving, because then you can always run and return back in case something scary happens. Now, separation protest, also known as separation anxiety, is a reaction to separations from this attachment figure. And kids will show, crying and whining and crawling and trying to get close to their mothers. So they protest. They don't want to be away from their mothers. Now, this increases between 8 and 15 months and then declines, and we see it across many cultures. So this is showing that they want to be near their secure base, and they feel more comfortable when the secure base, their mother or whoever the caregiver is there. Now, while this attachment is forming, children are developing what's called an internal working model. This is a set of expectations about one's worthiness of love. Do I deserve love? Does someone love me? Does someone want to take care of me? Will someone be there for me? So this is the idea, the child's idea of the availability of attachment figures and how they'll be treated. Now, this influences development of self-concept in infancy and also becomes a guide to their relationships later in life. If I feel like I will always be loved and I can trust other people to be there for me, then I can take risks. I can be vulnerable. I can go out and seek out relationships and know that if I get hurt, I can run back to the people who I trust, that it's going to be okay. But generally, I can trust people with my emotions and my thoughts. However, if I don't feel worthy of love, if I haven't been treated well, or if I've been treated inconsistently, then I won't feel confident, and maybe I'll try to hold on to my secure base because maybe the world is a scary, unsafe place. Or maybe I'll learn that no one is really there for me, that I'm all on my own. And therefore, I'll kind of build this wall up of protection that I have to protect myself. It was Mary Ainsworth who developed the procedure of the strange situation. And this is a test of the security of attachment. So the extent to which an infant feels that he or she can count on the parent to actually be there when he needs something. So it's a structured observational procedure, and the child is exposed to events of being separated and reunited with the parent and perhaps a stranger even being present. So the first episode, the event is the experimenter introduces the mother and infant to the playroom and then leaves. The next episode, the infant plays with toys and the parent is seated. And here we're looking at the mother as a secure base. Does the baby feel comfortable leaving the mother's side to go play with the toys, or is he very clingy? Episode 3, the stranger enters, talks with the caregiver, and approaches the infant. And what we're looking for is the reaction to the unfamiliar adult. Can they approach the unfamiliar adult with confidence, or are they scared, run to their mother, feel uncomfortable? Are they scared and not run to their mother? What happens? Episode 4, the mother leaves the room, and the stranger responds to the baby if the baby is upset. So here we're looking for the reaction to the separation from the mother. And even a secure baby at this time will react negatively. I mean, their secure base just walked out of the room. And a baby who is avoidant, which we'll get to in a moment, will perhaps not even care if the mother is leaving. But remember, it also depends on some past experiences. 5, the mother returns and greets the infant. We're looking at the reaction to the reunion. Number 6, the mother leaves the room, and so we're looking at the separation again. 7, the stranger enters the room and offers comfort to the infant. So we're looking for the reaction to the stranger and the infant's ability to be soothed by that stranger. And last, the mother returns and greets the infant and tries to interest the infant in toys. So we're looking at the reaction to the reunion. Is the infant able to be calmed by the mother? Do they continue to be angry with the mother for having left? Or do they now feel secure again and are able to show interest in the toys one more time? So based on the children's reaction to these different episodes, we can categorize infants into these 4 attachment types. The first one being secure attachment, and this is the attachment that leads to the most optimal outcomes. The infant does display stranger anxiety and separation protest. They don't want their secure base to leave, but when mom comes back, they greet her enthusiastically and they find comfort in her reunion, and so they use mother as a secure base. This is about 2/3 of infants. The second one is insecure avoidant. So avoidant infants really don't show much interest in their mom. They explore the room. They're not really distressed by the strange situation. They're not really enthusiastic about mom reuniting. And they actually show some subtle signs of avoidance, like looking away from her when she picks him up. This is about 20% of children. Number 3 is the insecure resistant attachment. And when they're resistant, there's a little bit of a mixed pattern. So they're worried about mom throughout the procedure. They want to be near her, but during reunions, they kind of resist. They show anger and distress. They're kind of mad at mom. And as we'll see soon, it's because perhaps she's been inconsistent in the past. So whenever she's gone, they kind of take this as an insult, but they want her to be there. So they cling onto her. They have anxiety. When she does leave and come back, then they're kind of upset with her about it. Number 4 is insecure, disorganized attachment. And these are inconsistent responses, behaviors that are contradictory. They may approach their caregiver, but then freeze or maybe flee or run away once the caregiver gets close. And it's thought that this is caused by a frightening parent, such as in the case of child abuse. And this is a really small percentage of infants, perhaps about 5% of infants show this disorganized type. Now, when we're asking about what leads to a secure attachment, the most optimal type of attachment, there are a few theories about that. And just kind of backing up a little bit, Freud and behaviorists thought that feeding was a motivator for attachment. So for Freud, it was, mom brings me oral satisfaction and gratification, and because of that, I want to be around her and I love her. Or for behaviorists, it's positive reinforcement for wanting to be around her and showing these behaviors. Now, Harry Harlow wanted to test this. He thought, is it really just because of feeding, which is what others were saying? Is that really the only reason why babies want to be around their mothers? So what he did is he reared baby rhesus monkeys by 2 inanimate surrogate mothers. So one was made of wire mesh and the other was made of terry cloth. And the wire mesh mother had milk and the terry cloth mother had no milk. So they're testing, do they prefer the milk or do they prefer more of this kind of soft comfort? So what they found is that the baby was much more likely to be around the cloth mother and really only return to the wire mother in order to feed. So it's not just feeding, it's not just food that makes a baby love and want to be around his mother, that it's more about contact comfort. So more than a parent's ability to feed the baby, instead it's the ability to comfort the baby. So this consistent and sensitive response to the child's signals. When a baby cries, mom comes and gives comfort and holds them and cares for them. This is likely to result in a stronger attachment. Insecurely attached infants are those who have mothers who are rigid, they're unresponsive to baby's needs, they're inconsistent, so sometimes they're there, sometimes they're not, or they're demanding in some way. Now, These attachment patterns tend to be fairly stable. Now, negative experiences can disrupt attachment. So if secure attachment is developing, but then there's a death of a primary caregiver, that can lead to one of the insecure attachment types. But as long as someone else steps in to fulfill the role of that attachment provider, then the child can go on to develop a secure attachment. Now, infants in many countries do approach that same strange situation in similar ways, but there are a few variations that we see. So, for example, in Western cultures, we see that infants are more likely to be categorized as anxious avoidant as opposed to anxious resistant. So when they're more avoidant, this may actually be a reflection of more of an independent culture as opposed to a collectivistic culture. So when they're raised to be independent and more likely to be raised by individuals, then they're more likely to be the avoidant type if they are insecurely attached. Whereas those who have been kind of passed around from person to person to person, sometimes people are there and sometimes not. So this is what can lead to the greater likelihood of the resistant type in more collectivistic cultures. Now, secure attachments are related to a host of positive developmental outcomes. So in early childhood, you can see the list here. They're more sociable, they have more positive interactions, greater social competence, they can read others' emotions and feel better about themselves. And in childhood and middle childhood and adolescence, again, they have more social competence, they can make and keep friends better, they can regulate their emotions, have higher self-esteem, greater peer competence, and less delinquency. So we see lots of positive outcomes associated with being securely attached to the child. Sorry, to the adult. So now moving on, adult attachment. So we were talking about infants and then how it affects relationships in childhood, and now talking about adulthood. Now, we see that this way that a person responds to others is consistent from infancy to adulthood to a certain extent. Again, it's not destiny, but it is often reflected in your adult relationships. So a childhood attachment predicts the internal working models, how I view others, how I see myself, if I can trust other people, and therefore relationship quality in early adulthood. So for adult attachment styles, and we're talking instead attachment toward parents, but now it's in romantic relationships and also friendships. It can be described as 4 styles. So this represents a combination of attachment anxiety, the degree of concern about whether partners will be responsive, and also avoidance, the degree of discomfort in being dependent on a partner. So the first type, secure, these individuals seek to bond with partners, they desire closeness, and are comforted by their partners. And this predicts positive romantic relationships. The anxious type tends to fear abandonment, always worry that the partner is going to leave them and doesn't really love them. They may feel unworthy of love and become overly dependent on their partner. So they show possessiveness and jealousy. And also they feel less trusting toward their partners. So very anxiously attached and then worry about their every behavior. But then also feel as though they can't really trust their partners. Number 3 is avoidant. They feel worthy of love, but they may not trust or depend on others. They feel that partners want more intimacy than they actually do. And these people can sometimes kind of put a wall up and keep people at a distance because they're uncomfortable sometimes with people being very close and clinging onto them. And then the last is disorganized. These individuals may be confused, an unpredictable mix of neediness, maybe fear of closeness. And these adult attachment styles influence parenting behaviors. So securely attached adults tend to be more sensitive and responsive as parents. And so therefore they are more likely to have securely attached infants. So this can go from generation to generation. Now, just a little bit left here. Temperament is also important when we're talking about the development of emotions in infancy. Temperament is kind of like an infant form of personality. It's a characteristic way in which an individual approaches and reacts to situation. So it's a basic building block of emotion and personality. Now, think about maybe the last time you were around different babies, or if not, if you're around like different puppies or even different kitties, and think about how those young animals or young babies differ just kind of naturally, even when they were born. Some are a little bit more hesitant, some are very brave, some are social, some are a little bit withdrawn. And what this is displaying is they're born that way. This temperament has strong biological determinants. It has a genetic basis. Now, it does reflect reciprocal interactions amongst genetic predisposition, maturation, and experience. So the anxious baby will be uncomfortable around new people. Those new people will kind of walk away from a baby who gets upset, and they will continue to kind of prefer only that which makes them comfortable. They will never become comfortable with that novelty. So with temperament, there's a tendency for the baby to affect the environment in a way that makes them react differently to them, and therefore it solidifies what kind of temperament and therefore personality that they have. So there are 9 characteristics involved with temperament: how active they are, rhythmicity, approach withdrawal, adaptability, the intensity of their reactions to new things, a threshold of responsiveness, quality of mood, distractibility, and attention span. So all of these 9 characteristics fall into 3 clusters of profiles, and this is what's shown on the table. An easy child is more likely to have a positive mood, is easy-tempered, open, adaptable, and has regular and predictable patterns in their biological functioning. And this is about 40% of babies. They accept frustration with little fuss, and they're very regular in their sleep and feeding schedules. A difficult child is more active and irritable. They have irregular sleeping and feeding schedules. They're slow to adapt, and they really react vigorously to change. So they're very uncomfortable with things being different. So they have trouble adjusting to new routines. And this is about 10% of babies. Then last is slow to warm up, and this is kind of like the in-between. So they're less active, they're moody, and they're slow to adapt to new situations or people. And they may react to these new situations with mild irritability, but they adjust a little bit more quickly than these difficult babies. And this is about 15% of children. So when we look at infants and they display these very typical ways of responding in one of these 3 categories, we ask, well, how stable is this? It is relatively stable over infancy, but it is especially open to environmental influences in infancy. So if the environment is there and likely to change and mold responses, then it can happen. This is not set in stone. Young infants' temperament can change with experience, neural development, and also sensitive caring. Now, in early childhood, temperament is a bit more consistent than in infancy, and it is predictive of later behavior, even into adulthood. Now, what affects whether or not a child does well with his particular temperament is dependent on context and goodness of fit. So their temperamental qualities evoke different reactions from others, and how others respond to these reactions kind of affect how the child actually does. But if a mother adjusts her expectations about her infant and has an expectation too that she is able to parent, that she can adjust even if her baby isn't always happy and easily social, then she'll be able to respond to her infant's needs. And we refer to this as goodness of fit, that the child's temperament matches the environment, and the mother or caregiver facilitates this. That for a difficult baby, she is able to adjust and help a difficult baby with the novelty and kind of ease them into it as opposed to force it upon them. Now, there are some consistent cultural differences in temperament, and these are rooted in cultural norms for how individuals are perceived. Cultural influences behaviors that parents view as desirable, and also the means that parents use in order to socialize their parents. All right, thank you so much for listening. I hope you had a wonderful time, and I will speak to you again for the next chapter.